So, think of the most heavily funded, architecturally celebrated cultural district you have ever visited.
Right, the ones that look flawless on the blueprints.
Exactly. I mean, you read the architectural reviews beforehand, and they were perfect. You saw the economic projections, and they were exceptional.
But then you actually arrive during peak season, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what actually happened, the physical flow of people was just completely paralyzed.
Well, absolutely
The
paralyzed.
public squares functioned as these chaotic pass-throughs instead of places of cultural reflection. The local institutions and, the operational systems just completely buckled entirely under the strain.
They fracture almost immediately.
Right. So you have to ask yourself, why do culturally significant, visually stunning environments still fail structurally the exact moment real-world pressure is applied?
And that is the core structural question. Because tradition dictates that when you evaluate a cultural environment, say a historic neighborhood or a massive institutional complex, you measure its success through entirely subjective impressions, like aesthetic appeal.
Exactly, aesthetic appeal. You look at aesthetics, or you look at fragmented operational metrics, or you rely on these highly inconsistent criteria like pure visitor volume.
Which, I mean, those interpretive methods consistently lead to unpredictable performance.
They absolutely do. They produce weak identity structures and fundamentally unstable cultural networks.
You end up with assets that look impressive on paper, but, they completely collapse under physical spatial reality.
Which is exactly why a fundamental shift is required here. I mean, we must transition entirely from subjective evaluation to deterministic structural diagnosis.
Right, we have to strip away the opinion.
Exactly. When you evaluate cultural systems through the lens of aesthetic judgment or just sheer volume, you actively mask the underlying forces that actually dictate how that environment behaves.
You're measuring the surface.
Yes, you're measuring the surface, but you are completely ignoring the load-bearing architecture of the cultural asset itself. So, if we are stripping away subjective opinion and tossing out aesthetic judgment entirely, we need a system that actually measures structural truth.
We do.
And that brings us directly to Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI. We need to clearly define what this system is and what it executes on a daily operational basis for you as an executive.
Well, Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI functions as a universal diagnostic system.
A diagnostic system, not a rating system.
Right, exactly. Its precise function is to evaluate the structural behavior, the resilience, and the experiential reliability of any cultural asset.
So it doesn't just scan a district and ask, is this beautiful?
No, absolutely not. It evaluates the capacity of that asset to deliver a coherent cultural experience consistently.
Consistently, regardless of physical variation or, spatial pressure.
Exactly. Regardless of physical variation, spatial pressure, or any external change, it provides a deterministic, non-interpretative framework.
That is the definitive baseline. But to apply this diagnostic system, we probably need to establish what actually constitutes a cultural asset within this strict framework.
We do. A cultural asset is basically any spatial, institutional, or experiential node that actively contributes to the cultural identity of a territory.
So we're talking about heritage sites, public promenades.
Yes, creative clusters, highly dense mixed-use environments.
Okay, got it.
What unites them all is their cultural behavior. It's their capacity to project a coherent identity, to support cultural infrastructure, and to adapt to spatial variation without losing coherence.
Right. So Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, is structurally analyzing that behavior.
Exactly. It is a structural behavioral intelligence system.
Okay, but I have to pause you right there because I am anticipating the immediate pushback from, anyone who operates in the cultural sector.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, you are dealing with human expression, heritage, art, meaning. Why must we remove aesthetic judgment entirely to evaluate a cultural environment?
It's a common question.
It just seems entirely counterintuitive to diagnose something as inherently human as culture without evaluating taste or artistic merit.
Well, that tension is exactly why this diagnostic system is so critical. The answer lies in the fundamental philosophy governing the system: stability before aesthetics, structure before opinion.
Stability before aesthetics. Structure before opinion.
Exactly. This represents a definitive, non-negotiable shift in cultural analysis. Aesthetic judgments are inherently volatile.
Because they fluctuate.
Right, they fluctuate based on immediate trends, individual preferences, temporal shifts. If you build your strategic decision-making on taste, you are building on a fundamentally unstable foundation.
So Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI just doesn't measure artistic merit at all.
No, because artistic merit cannot be mathematically governed or structurally relied upon under intense operational stress.
Okay, that makes sense.
Instead, it measures stability. Stability is a strict structural condition. The system evaluates the deterministic, non-interpretative framework of the asset.
So the questions become strictly structural.
Precisely. The questions are, can this museum maintain its experiential continuity when physical load exceeds its standard spatial capacity by 40%?
Wow. Okay. Or, like, can this heritage district physically integrate new operational infrastructure without suffering immediate identity dilution?
Exactly. Those are structural truths. They are measurable. By strictly removing opinion, we isolate the exact structural misalignments that cause an asset to fail.
Okay, so to visualize this, to replace our human intuition with a rigid diagnostic system, we must define the physical and operational components that actually bear the load.
We have to measure the specific structural forces at play.
Right, and to do that, we use the 5 stability pillars. Let's systematically break down each one.
Yes, these operate as the load-bearing pillars of the diagnostic framework.
Okay, so for every pillar, we need to understand what it measures, what the precise failure state looks like on the ground, what the stable equilibrium looks like, the specific diagnostic signal it produces, and, how it interacts with the rest of the system.
That is the strict protocol.
Let's start right at the foundation. Pillar 02A, symbolic anchoring.
Okay, so symbolic anchoring measures the clarity, strength, and recognizability of an asset's symbolic grammar.
Symbolic grammar. So we are evaluating architectural expression.
Yes, architectural expression, historical resonance, and the precise environmental signals that define the character of the asset. We are measuring structural clarity.
So what's the core diagnostic question here?
The question is, does the physical morphology of the asset communicate its identity without requiring external explanation or signage?
Oh, wow. So if an asset has strong symbolic anchoring, you just don't need a visitor center to orient you.
Exactly. The physical space itself immediately grounds you in its cultural context.
But when that fails, we are diagnosing what Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI calls identity dilution.
Right. This is ambiguity. This is identity drift.
Like if the architectural expression of a heritage site becomes structurally inconsistent because of, say, poorly integrated modern development.
Exactly. The historical resonance weakens. The asset loses its symbolic clarity and essentially becomes a generic pass-through space.
So what does this stable state look like?
The stable state provides immediate spatial orientation and structural coherence without any explanation. The asset feels grounded and culturally dense.
And when Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, evaluates this pillar, what is the specific diagnostic signal produced?
The specific signal is the identity threshold.
Identity threshold, yes.
The system detects the precise indicator signaling when symbolic clarity begins to degrade under pressure.
Even if that degradation is not yet visually apparent to a human observer.
Exactly. It detects the structural threshold before the visual failure.
Wow. And we have to map how this pillar interacts systemically, right?
We do. Symbolic anchoring acts as the absolute baseline for the fifth pillar, adaptability.
So it ensures that as the cultural asset evolves over, say, a 20-year period, that long-term evolution does not trigger an identity loss.
Precisely. The symbolic foundation must remain intact for adaptation to remain completely stable.
Which brings us to the second pillar. Pillar 02B, narrative continuity.
Right. Narrative continuity measures how well an asset fits within the broader cultural story and structural logic of its environment.
So we are diagnosing the sequence of meanings, themes, and spatial experiences.
Exactly. Does this specific spatial node reinforce the thematic sequence of the broader network, or does it actively disrupt the cultural flow?
To put that into physical reality, the failure state here is narrative fragmentation, right?
Yes. Narrative fragmentation happens when an asset creates an abrupt experiential break.
I mean, imagine you are moving through a deeply historical, quiet heritage zone, and suddenly you are thrust into an ultra-modern, neon-lit commercial transit corridor.
With zero thematic transition, exactly. That completely disrupts the cultural logic.
Right, because the commercial asset might be highly valuable in isolation, But by introducing contradictory themes, it structurally destabilizes the total environment.
That is a perfect example of narrative fragmentation. The stable state, conversely, is strict thematic coherence.
So stability and narrative continuity means the asset continuously reinforces the spatial and cultural flow of its neighbors.
Correct. And the diagnostic signals produced here are experiential thresholds.
Experiential thresholds, what exactly are those?
These are concrete indicators of spatial disorientation. The diagnostic system detects that a user experiences an abrupt physical or thematic shift that actively breaks their engagement.
Okay, and systemically, how does narrative continuity interact with the rest of the asset?
It directly increases experiential capacity within the asset.
Oh, because by maintaining a coherent thematic sequence, the physical space can actually process a higher volume of symbolic and experiential load.
Exactly. It processes that load without confusing the user or creating spatial bottlenecks.
That transitions us perfectly into the literal physical capacity of the space. Pillar 02C, cultural infrastructure.
Right. Pillar 02C measures the depth, density, and accessibility of resources actively supporting the cultural experience.
So we are evaluating the institutions, the heritage preservation elements, the public gathering spaces.
And the underlying operational systems that sustain physical activity.
We are talking about the physical and institutional plumbing of the space.
Yes, exactly. And if an asset fails here, the system diagnoses infrastructural insufficiency.
Which presents on the ground as extreme fragility and dependence.
Right. I mean, a cultural venue might have incredible symbolic value, but if it lacks the operational resources to support a stable experience,
Like inadequate public restrooms, or poor transit access, or limited institutional presence.
exactly, it simply cannot sustain itself under pressure. The structure fractures.
So the stable state for cultural infrastructure must be characterized by profound redundancy.
Redundancy, resilience, and sustained cultural capacity. An asset with structurally sound infrastructure can absorb diverse physical activities without any operational strain.
And the diagnostic signals produced by evaluating this pillar.
Those are operational stress and bottleneck indicators. Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, detects exactly where the logistical, spatial, or institutional support begins to fracture.
Okay, and its critical interaction within the diagnostic system.
Cultural infrastructure provides the necessary operational foundation required for the fourth pillar, elasticity, to function under load.
So if you do not possess infrastructural redundancy, your elasticity will instantly collapse the moment spatial pressure is applied.
Exactly, which is why Pillar 2D, elasticity, is so vital to evaluate.
So let's define Pillar 02D. Elasticity measures the structural ability of the asset to absorb variation without degrading the cultural experience.
Right. We are evaluating resilience against immediate fluctuations in visitor flows, shifting environmental conditions, and sudden external operational disruptions.
I always think of this as the Tuesday morning versus Saturday afternoon test.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The failure state here is elasticity collapse.
And elasticity collapse is a sudden, total experiential failure, right?
Yes. It triggers when the immediate load, whether that is physical density or operational demand, exceeds the spatial capacity of the asset.
So the physical environment simply cannot absorb the density wave, and the cultural experience degrades into chaos instantly.
Exactly. The system just buckles. Stability here, though, equates to structural resilience under immediate, intense stress.
The asset bends, processes the physical variation, and fundamentally maintains its spatial coherence.
Correct. The diagnostic signals produced are spatial capacity and physical load constraints.
So the system measures the exact threshold where physical density actively overwhelms the experiential field.
Yes. And systemically, elasticity relieves pressure on cultural infrastructure during peak cultural load.
Right, by providing spatial and experiential flexibility, like having adaptable public squares that can temporarily absorb overflow.
Exactly. That prevents the institutional and operational systems from reaching their permanent failure points.
Okay, so finally, we evaluate the temporal dimension of stability. Pillar 02E, adaptability.
Right. Adaptability measures the long-term capacity of the asset to evolve, transform, and integrate new cultural inputs.
But it has to do so while rigorously maintaining its core structural logic.
Exactly. That is the key constraint. When adaptability fails, the system detects adaptive breakdown.
And adaptive breakdown presents physically in two forms.
Yes. First is complete stagnation, where the asset actively resists necessary operational upgrades and essentially becomes obsolete.
And the second form.
Uncontrolled, chaotic physical change that actively erodes the identity and structural logic of the environment.
So the stable state ensures long-term cultural relevance across generations.
Yeah.
The asset integrates new infrastructure without destroying the historic baseline.
Exactly. And the diagnostic signals produced here are temporal risk and long-term stability markers.
Right. And as we established when we started with Pillar O2A, its interaction requires it to align perfectly with symbolic anchoring to maintain complete cultural continuity.
Yes, they are structurally linked.
But here is where I really must challenge the mechanics of this diagnostic engine again.
Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned detecting symbolic grammar and experiential thresholds. How does a strict mathematical system strictly quantify something as intangible as symbolic meaning?
Without injecting a human operator's personal bias.
Exactly. How do you measure an atmosphere structurally?
It achieves this because Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, evaluates structural coherence and spatial alignment, not aesthetic preference.
Okay, break that down for me.
When the system reads symbolic grammar, it is not evaluating if the architecture is aesthetically pleasing to a certain demographic. It is scanning for structural contradictions
Contradictions between what?
between the identity layer and the physical experiential layer. It measures whether the physical morphology of the space structurally aligns with the historic resonance it claims to project.
Oh, I see. So if a heritage site claims to offer a slow, contemplative historical experience,
But its spatial layout forces movement patterns that actively obstruct the heritage elements.
and funnels users into a cramped, high-speed bottleneck,
Exactly. That is a measurable structural contradiction. The spatial flow actively contradicts the symbolic intent.
wow, okay, so it is a strict mathematical evaluation of spatial alignment and load, completely divorced from a subjective critique of form.
Precisely. It is pure structural diagnosis.
So measuring these 5 pillars provides us with the raw structural data. But, raw diagnostic data is completely insufficient for a CEO, an urban planner, or an executive decision maker.
Absolutely. Data alone does not drive governance.
We have to define how this raw data is synthesized into structured outputs that actually drive action.
And this requires us to examine the 2 primary outputs generated by the system.
Let's start with output O3A, the cultural stability profile.
Right. The cultural stability profile is the central output, and it is vital to understand that this is not a static score.
It's not just a simple grade or a ranking,
No, not at all. It is a comprehensive, dynamic structural map of cultural behavior.
and it is assembled by integrating 5 distinct layers of diagnostic assessment, correct?
Yes. The strict construction of this cultural stability profile integrates the pillar assessment we just discussed, plus the behavioral assessment, the network assessment, the risk and resilience assessment, and the coherence assessment.
So when we look at the behavioral layer, the system is actively evaluating the spatial morphology, the physical flow, the density constraints, and the intensity of the asset in real time.
Exactly. And then the network layer evaluates the asset's structural relationship with its immediate surroundings.
Measuring spatial adjacency and cultural gravity.
Right, as well as its specific systemic role and its strategic positioning within the broader urban or institutional environment.
So when all 5 of those layers are integrated, what exactly does the profile reveal to the executive?
The contents of the cultural stability profile reveal the exact structural strengths, weaknesses, spatial collapse points, resilience patterns, and long-term trajectories of the asset.
So the decision-making utility of this profile is just absolute.
It is the definitive foundation for all strategic interventions.
Right. Whether leadership is planning a massive urban infrastructure project, designing a new mixed-use development, programming a cultural venue, or preserving a historic district.
The profile identifies the exact physical location of structural misalignments. It tells the executive exactly where the spatial load exceeds the operational capacity.
And this brings us directly to output O3B, which are the key insights derived directly from the profile.
Yes. The variables we discussed earlier, identity, narrative, infrastructure, elasticity, and adaptability, are never read as static, isolated scores.
They are read dynamically, right? They are evaluated as interconnected structural states.
Exactly.
So for instance, when an executive reads a cultural stability profile, it might clearly indicate that an asset possesses extremely high symbolic density.
Meaning its heritage and architectural identity signals are structurally profound and exerting massive pull.
Right. But simultaneously, the profile shows severe infrastructural insufficiency.
Exactly. And that specific targeted discrepancy is how the diagnostic engine pinpoints the exact root cause of an elasticity collapse.
Oh, because the system explicitly shows that the high symbolic density is generating a massive symbolic pull, what the system terms cultural gravity, which is drawing intense physical flow toward the asset,
Yes, but because the infrastructural redundancy is diagnosed as insufficient, the operational systems simply cannot support that physical flow.
which leads directly to elasticity collapse.
Precisely. The insight provided to leadership is entirely deterministic.
You do not fix the physical collapse by redesigning the aesthetics of the plaza.
Or by launching a marketing campaign to change user behavior? No. You fix it by structurally increasing the operational infrastructure to match the exact symbolic load.
Okay, now to understand how this profile is executed upon in a real-world scenario, we really have to clearly define where Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, sits within the total operational architecture.
This is critical.
Right, because if Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, diagnoses the collapse, who actually initiates the structural fix? We must establish the strict hierarchy and the functional boundaries of the broader structural systems.
Yes, this is a critical functional distinction. The systems must remain strictly separated by function. Their roles do not blur under any circumstance.
Okay, so let's start with Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI.
Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, operates strictly as the stability diagnostic engine.
It diagnoses and evaluates structural truth.
Exactly. It reads the inputs, identifies the spatial contradictions, calculates the load, and generates the intelligence. That is its absolute boundary.
So above that diagnostic engine sits the execution layer, which is the Cultural Operating System, COS.
Right. The Cultural Operating System, COS, is the overarching system architecture and the execution engine.
It governs and operationalizes the structural insights that are continuously generated by Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI.
Exactly. Furthermore, within this architecture, we have specialized valuation and transformation layers.
Right, like the Cultural and Creative Performance Index, CCPI.
Yes. The Cultural and Creative Performance Index, CCPI, functions purely as the economic value layer. It specifically measures the financial, creative, and commercial performance metrics of the environment.
And then we have the Space Perceived Value Index, SPVI, right?
Correct. The Space Perceived Value Index, SPVI, operates strictly as the perception and behavioral layer. It evaluates how the physical space is actually internalized and perceived by the user demographics.
Finally, there's the Art-Driven Spatial Method, ADSM.
Yes, the art-driven spatial method, ADSM, acts as the specific transformation method. And we really must emphasize the rigid functional boundaries here.
Right, because Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, is strictly diagnostic.
Exactly. If Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, detects a severe network contradiction, for example, it detects that a new high-speed experiential flow is actively disrupting a quiet symbolic anchor, it does not execute the fix.
It does not redesign the morphology of the space.
No, it feeds that exact mathematical structural intelligence directly to the Cultural Operating System, COS.
And then the Cultural Operating System, COS, receives that structural intelligence, evaluates the systemic impact, and then triggers the necessary intervention sequence.
Yes, the Cultural Operating System, COS, deploys the appropriate structural resources, or it activates the art-driven spatial method, ADSM, to actively correct the physical morphology of the space.
So to summarize that, Hierarchy Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSA, provides the architectural truth, and the Cultural Operating System, COS, provides the operational power and governance.
That is exactly how the architecture functions.
Okay, so if Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, is constantly running this diagnostic protocol, what exactly is it measuring in real time?
It is measuring the environment's equilibrium.
Right. We need to detail the dynamic operational conditions of a cultural asset. These are defined as the stability states in Section 05.
There are 4 strictly defined states of equilibrium that dictate the structural condition of any spatial asset at any given moment.
Let's start with the first one. Baseline, or stable equilibrium.
Baseline defines the inherent coherence of an asset under normal, predictable operational conditions.
So in this state, all structural forces, the identity markers, the institutional infrastructure, the narrative flow, the spatial behavior, they all actively reinforce each other.
Exactly. The system is entirely coherent and structurally stable.
The second state is elastic equilibrium. This measures the asset's structural behavior under immediate pressure.
Yes, this is stress stability. The physical environment is subjected to variation, perhaps a massive, unexpected influx of visitor flow, or a sudden operational constraint like a transit failure.
But in elastic equilibrium, the structural system absorbs the disruption.
Right. It bends under the physical or operational load, but it fundamentally maintains its structural coherence. The cultural experience does not fracture.
Then we hit the third state, which is critical equilibrium.
Critical equilibrium is the precise, mathematically defined threshold point where the total cultural load exactly equals the maximum structural capacity of the asset.
So that's combining physical density, symbolic expectations, and active operational demands. They are exactly matching the capacity.
Yes. The system is operating at its absolute limit. The structural risk is highly elevated, and the spatial environment is on the verge of instability.
Any additional physical or operational pressure will immediately break the coherence.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final state,
Yeah.
collapse.
This is the exact point at which the structural failure modes actively trigger, right?
Yes. The spatial load has decisively exceeded the operational capacity.
So you visually see elasticity collapse, identity dilution, or severe narrative fragmentation on the ground.
There is a total loss of structural coherence, and the experiential reliability degrades rapidly into chaos.
And we must strictly analyze the structural transitions between these states, because an asset does not move from baseline equilibrium to collapse randomly or inexplicably.
No, never. These transitions are triggered by precise, measurable, systemic shifts.
A transition might be triggered by a sudden shift in physical cultural flows that actively overwhelms the established spatial morphology.
Or it could be triggered by introducing completely incompatible commercial adjacencies within the cultural network.
Or, crucially, it happens when executive leadership executes spatial interventions that actively increase the cultural load without initiating parallel, required increases in infrastructural capacity.
That is one of the most common triggers.
Which brings up a vital diagnostic question for anyone relying on this intelligence. At what precise point does an operational stress officially become a threshold?
That is the pivotal question.
How does the diagnostic engine detect the exact mathematical moment an asset shifts from elastic equilibrium into critical equilibrium before the human eye can even perceive the crowding?
Well, detecting that precise shift requires a highly specific analytical mechanism. It requires continuously evaluating the exact ratio of active load to structural capacity across all three fundamental layers: the physical layer, the symbolic layer, and the operational layer.
So when the diagnostic engine detects that operational redundancy has reached absolute zero and calculates that any further physical flow will physically force a breakdown in narrative continuity,
Yeah.
it registers that exact threshold.
Precisely. And tracing that analytical mechanism means we must systematically break down the diagram logic of the engine itself.
Yes, sections 06. We need to follow the linear path of the system. Inputs to analysis to outputs. Let us rigorously trace the inputs first.
Okay, so Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, continuously reads specific measurable signals from the physical environment.
It reads identity signals.
Yes, which physically include the density of symbolic markers and the structural architectural presence of cultural memory.
It also reads narrative signals, tracking the thematic alignment and the physical sequence of the space.
And it reads infrastructure signals, which strictly evaluate institutional support levels, spatial redundancy, and the actual physical flow patterns of users moving through the morphology.
So once those inputs are acquired, the system performs rigorous, continuous analytical operations.
Exactly. Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, calculates the precise structural alignment of these inputs.
It measures the total incoming cultural load against the verified structural capacity of the asset.
Right. It diagnoses any structural contradictions existing between the layers, like a spatial flow that contradicts a symbolic anchor.
And critically, it evaluates network adjacencies.
Yes, measuring exactly how the asset physically, symbolically, and experientially aligns with its immediate adjacent neighbors in the network.
So the final phase of this strict logic path is the generation of the structured outputs.
Exactly. The system produces the formal cultural stability profile we detailed earlier.
And it also generates immediate system alerts.
Yes. These alerts, detailing precise thresholds and impending failure modes, are fed directly into the Cultural Operating System, COS, to instantly trigger executive governance actions.
This explicit deterministic logic is exactly why this diagnostic engine completely replaces intuition with structural intelligence.
It is. It takes the historically invisible forces of a cultural environment atmosphere, thematic meaning, spatial tension, cultural memory, and renders them mathematically governable.
It makes the invisible completely structural.
Exactly.
So we now possess the strict definitions, the operational states, and the linear logic of the engine. To truly comprehend its executive utility, we must apply this diagnostic system to spatial reality.
We must examine strictly analytical use cases that physically demonstrate exactly what Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI diagnoses.
And precisely how that diagnosis fundamentally changes structural decisions. Let's execute case 1, a district.
Okay. In this highly specific scenario, we are evaluating a sprawling, mixed-use urban cultural district that is experiencing severe operational issues.
The structural diagnosis generated by Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI detects a severe localized weakness in infrastructural adjacency.
Right. The district possesses massive symbolic gravity, constantly drawing massive physical crowds.
But the operational systems and the physical public spaces connecting the primary nodes are disjointed and completely lack redundancy.
Yes. And the system explicitly identifies that this weak infrastructural adjacency is the direct structural cause of an elasticity collapse during periods of peak physical flow.
The public spaces simply cannot process the density waves, leading to experiential failure.
Exactly. Now, this precise structural diagnosis changes the executive decision entirely.
Without this deterministic intelligence, leadership might have attempted to solve the visible crowding issue by redesigning the aesthetics of the plazas.
Or launching a new marketing campaign to redirect visitor behavior, which happens all the time.
Right. But with the structural diagnosis in hand, resources are immediately redirected from aesthetic redesigns directly to structural reinforcement.
Specifically, the intelligence is fed to the Cultural Operating System, COS.
Which initiates a strict intervention to drastically increase infrastructural redundancy.
Yes, building out parallel physical support systems and actively adjusting the spatial morphology to structurally stabilize the physical flow.
The problem was entirely structural, and the executed solution is entirely structural.
Precisely. Let us move to case 2, a museum or cultural venue.
Okay, in this venue, Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, returns a profile indicating extremely high symbolic density.
Meaning the internal architecture is iconic and the heritage elements are profound.
However, the system diagnoses severe narrative fragmentation and a critical experiential contradiction with the museum's immediate external environment.
The internal thematic sequence completely contradicts the physical and symbolic logic of the surrounding urban district.
Right. The spatial flow inside actively clashes with the spatial flow outside.
So the executive decision change here is profound. The diagnosis dictates a strict physical realignment of the experiential layer.
The required intervention demands actively adjusting the internal morphological flow.
And physically restructuring the thematic transition zones to perfectly match the broader narrative of the external district.
So by executing this structural adjustment, the Cultural Operating System, COS, corrects the experiential contradiction.
It restores total cultural alignment between the specific asset and its broader network. It structurally integrates the isolated node back into the coherent system.
Finally, let's examine case 3, a cultural corridor or network.
The diagnostic engine evaluates a massive, large-scale cultural network.
And the generated diagnosis reveals a critical systemic structural risk.
Yes, the entire physical network relies almost exclusively on a single anchor asset.
Right. This primary anchor possesses massive cultural gravity, but because it is bearing the physical and symbolic load of the entire network, it is rapidly reaching critical equilibrium.
Due to severe, sustained operational overload, the network's foundational architecture is diagnosed as fundamentally fragile.
So the diagnosis forces a massive strategic shift in governance.
It does. To stabilize the network architecture before total collapse, the executive decision is made to actively reposition adjacent secondary background assets into vital connector roles.
So by structurally upgrading the physical capacity of the surrounding nodes and establishing strong experiential adjacency, the Cultural Operating System, COS, actively distributes the physical cultural flow away from the overloaded anchor.
Exactly. This structurally rebalances the cultural density of the entire corridor.
And directly pulls the primary anchor back from critical equilibrium into a state of stable baseline equilibrium.
These precise analytical cases demonstrate definitively that moving from practical spatial application to high-level strategic governance requires a rigorous structural framework.
You cannot govern a network through intuition.
You simply cannot.
Which brings us to our final synthesis, our executive snapshot. We must deliver the definitive executive summary of this entire diagnostic framework. Cultural Stability Intelligence CSI functions as the universal diagnostic engine that mathematically measures the structural behavior, spatial resilience, and equilibrium of cultural assets under real-world conditions.
It is the historically missing diagnostic layer in cultural planning, executive governance, and strategic decision-making.
For decades, institutions have repeatedly attempted to govern highly complex cultural networks using strictly economic metrics.
Or highly volatile aesthetic opinions. But without this structural truth, without precisely understanding spatial load, operational capacity, physical adjacency, and thematic coherence, cultural networks remain fundamentally fragile.
Right. Cultural Stability Intelligence, CSI, provides the definitive architectural truth of cultural behavior.
It does.
So you now understand the rigorous mechanics of spatial stability. You understand exactly how identity, operational infrastructure, and physical flow are mathematically evaluated and strictly governed.
The invisible forces are now visible.
Exactly. But this leaves you with a definitive structural question to deeply consider as you examine the architecture of your own environments.
A critical question.
If cultural stability can now be deterministically evaluated and strictly governed, what is the exact fate of cultural assets that refuse to structurally align?
Right.
If a specific asset chronically destabilizes a broader network, continuously generating narrative fragmentation and elasticity collapse despite repeated structural intervention, how will the Cultural Operating System, COS, eventually isolate it to completely protect the structural equilibrium of the total system?